Here's something that's been getting completely lost under the Iran ceasefire coverage, the World Cup, and everything else fighting for your attention right now. China doesn't need a missile to shut down American healthcare. It just needs to stop shipping. And the medication in your cabinet right now is almost certainly part of the reason why. I don't work for a bank, a government, or a news network. I've spent 7 years doing nothing but watching where the global order breaks, the fractures that form years before anyone calls them a crisis. Judge this by whether the analysis holds up. Today, I want to walk you through something most coverage either misses entirely or buries in technical language designed to make your eyes glaze over. The United States is dependent on China for something more fundamental than oil, more immediate than semiconductors, and more personal than trade deficits. And the gap between where America is today and where it needs to be is measured not in months, but in decades. Stay with me, because this one lands closer to home than most people realize. Start with a number, 17. That's how many elements on the periodic table are classified as rare earth elements. Most people have never heard their names. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, praseodymium, not household words, but remove them from the modern world and the modern world stops. The motor in a hybrid car, the guidance system in a missile, the speaker in a hearing aid, the screen on a medical imaging device, the battery in a pacemaker, all of them require rare earths to function. There is no substitute. There is no workaround. These elements do things that nothing else can do at any price. Now here is what China actually controls, and this is the detail that gets consistently undersold in most coverage. China does not simply mine rare earths, it processes them. The distinction matters enormously, and here is why. Mining produces ore, raw rock containing the elements in dilute, chemically complex form. Processing converts that ore into usable materials, purified metals, alloys, and compounds that manufacturers can actually work with. Processing is expensive, technically demanding, environmentally intensive, and takes years to build to scale. It is where the real chokehold exists. China controls approximately 70% of global rare earth processing, not 70% of one material, 70% of the entire category, and in specific materials, the heavy rare earths that go into the most advanced defense and medical applications, the figure is higher, closer to 85 or 90%. Here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. The United States produces rare earths domestically. There is a mine in California, Mountain Pass, that extracts significant quantities. But for years, that ore was shipped to China for processing, then purchased back as finished material. America was mining its own strategic resources, handing them to its primary geopolitical competitor to refine, and buying them back at a markup. That arrangement has been partially unwound in recent years. But the processing infrastructure that would allow the US to handle its own rare earths from mine to finished material doesn't exist at meaningful scale yet. And building it takes time that, right now, America doesn't have comfortably in hand. Now let's talk about what this means for the medication in your cabinet, because this is where the rare earth story connects to something more immediate than defense contracts or electric vehicles. Active pharmaceutical ingredients, the chemical compounds that actually make medicine work as opposed to the fillers and coatings around them, are produced overwhelmingly in China and India. The US Food and Drug Administration has, in various assessments, identified Chinese-sourced active ingredients in the majority of generic drugs dispensed at American pharmacies. Antibiotics, blood pressure medication, diabetes treatments, cholesterol drugs, the generics that most people over 60 take daily, that keep chronic conditions managed, that make retirement health costs predictable. These drugs depend on supply chains that run through Chinese manufacturing facilities. This is not a recent vulnerability. It developed over decades, gradually, as pharmaceutical manufacturing migrated offshore in search of lower production costs. By the time anyone in Washington was paying serious attention, the dependency was structural. You don't rebuild a pharmaceutical supply chain quickly. The facilities, the regulatory approvals, the trained workforce, all of it takes years and billions of dollars to establish domestically at scale. Now combine those two vulnerabilities, rare earth processing and pharmaceutical supply, and you begin to see the shape of what China actually holds. A country that controls how the world's medicine gets made, how the world's most advanced defense components get manufactured, and how the chips and magnets that run modern technology get refined, doesn't need an army to bring a rival to the table. It needs patience. And the leverage it holds operates silently, in peacetime, through the ordinary functioning of global supply chains that most people never think about until they stop working. China has demonstrated, at least once, that it is willing to weaponize this leverage. In 2010, following a territorial dispute with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, China restricted rare earth exports to Japanese buyers. Prices spiked approximately 750% within months. Japan, which had built its precision manufacturing industry on assumptions of continued Chinese rare earth supply, found itself with almost no alternatives at short notice. The dispute was resolved, the restriction was lifted, but the lesson was not lost on anyone paying attention. China had used supply chain leverage as a foreign policy tool, and it had worked. The United States is significantly more exposed today than Japan was in 2010. Japan was dependent on rare earths for industrial manufacturing. America is dependent on rare earths for industrial manufacturing, defense systems, medical devices, and consumer technology simultaneously. The breadth of the exposure across so many sectors at once means that a restriction or disruption doesn't hit one industry. It cascades. Washington has known about this vulnerability for years, and the response, at least in terms of policy intent, has been substantive. The Forge Initiative, facilitating rare earth and other materials for energy and geopolitical resilience, represents the most serious American attempt to address the processing gap directly. $30 billion in committed federal funding directed at building domestic rare earth refining capacity, developing allied supply chains, and reducing dependence on Chinese processing at each stage of the supply chain. $30 billion is serious money. The question worth sitting with is whether it's enough, and more importantly, whether it's fast enough. Industry analysts looking at the build-out timeline for rare earth processing infrastructure, the permitting, the environmental review, the facility construction, the workforce training, the production ramp-up, consistently arrive at estimates of 10 to 15 years before Forge produces meaningful scale. Optimistic scenarios say 10, more cautious assessments say 15 or beyond. The US government's own projections do not claim the gap will close quickly. That timeline means the vulnerability is not a future problem. It is a current one. The gap between where American processing capacity sits today and where it needs to be to operate without Chinese dependence is open right now. And every day it remains open is a day when the leverage China holds over American medicine, American defense, and American technology is real and deployable. This does not mean a confrontation is imminent. China has strong economic reasons not to weaponize this leverage recklessly. Disrupting global supply chains harms Chinese manufacturers and Chinese export revenues as well. The interdependence is not one-directional, but the 2010 Japan episode shows that under sufficient geopolitical pressure, China has been willing to accept short-term economic cost in exchange for strategic leverage. And the current US-China relationship, with export controls on semiconductors, tariffs, pack silica supply chain realignment, and ongoing friction over Taiwan, is operating at a level of pressure that 2010 did not approach. For anyone living on a fixed income or drawing down savings, this story connects to your life in two direct ways. The first is medication costs. A disruption or restriction in Chinese pharmaceutical ingredient supply would hit the generic drug market, the affordable drugs most retirees depend on, before it hit anything else. Prices would rise. Availability would tighten. the healthcare costs that already consume a growing share of retirement income would come under additional pressure through a mechanism that has nothing to do with domestic policy and everything to do with a supply chain nobody in Washington is explaining clearly. The second is the defense budget. Closing the rare earth processing gap costs money. Rebuilding pharmaceutical supply chains costs money. The Forge Initiative costs $30 billion. The broader effort to restructure American supply chains away from Chinese dependence, which runs through every major sector simultaneously, is one of the most expensive industrial policy programs in American history. That money competes with every other line in the federal budget, including the ones that fund the retirement systems and healthcare programs that this generation paid into for 40 years. The last time America faced a supply chain vulnerability of this scale, it was oil. After the 1973 embargo, which anyone who lived through it will remember as the moment the price of fuel went from background noise to front-page news, the United States spent 50 years diversifying its energy sources, building strategic reserves, and ultimately becoming the world's largest oil producer. That transition took 5 decades and enormous sustained investment. It worked, but it didn't happen quickly and it didn't happen cheaply. The rare earth and pharmaceutical challenge is structurally similar. It requires sustained investment, allied coordination, patient industrial policy, and time. The difference is that in 1973, the leverage was held by countries with limited ability to project it beyond oil. Today, the leverage is held by the world's second-largest economy across multiple sectors simultaneously, embedded in supply chains that took decades to build and will take decades to replace. China doesn't control a territory, it controls a process, and a country that controls how the world's medicine gets made doesn't need an army to bring a rival to the table. The Forge Initiative is a serious response. It is not a quick one. And in the gap between today and when it produces results, the medication in your cabinet, the defense systems protecting your country, and the technology your retirement savings are invested in all pass through a supply chain that runs in critical stages through China. Understanding that gap exists is the beginning. Watching whether the response closes it in time is what comes next. This is James Whitmore. I'll be back when this moves. Subscribe if you want to be there when it does.